back at 2022, despite great turmoil in the world that's going on, if we zoom into the gaming regulatory landscape itself, I think there hasn't really been anything drastic, tremendously different going on in 2022. Instead, the trends that established earlier, the trends that established earlier, more and more local regulatory licenses, dealing with more and more complex and costly compliance, these trends have continued in 2022. But in Malta, there was actually a very interesting and positive change in 2022, and this is the fact that in June this year, the horrible Manival grey cloud that was over our heads has passed. Actually, it's better than passed. It's passed to a competitor, but the most important that it's actually passed. So last year at this stage, we were looking into negative consequences of grey listing on the operators, on the banking environment in Malta. This year, I would like to ask the panel whether they've seen any positive shifts. Enrico, you've been very vocal about grey listing and its negative effect. Can you enlighten us what you see, whether there are any positive effects locally, in particular in the banking industry, in the way it treats the gaming clients here?
So, good morning. Thanks, Olga. Yes, the grey cloud has been lifted, and it's been, I think, very, very good from a reputational perspective. I think this is the immediate action, or the immediate benefit, is that there is no longer this status that was affecting the entire jurisdiction. And this was affecting pretty much the money flows in and out of Malta, not so much within the Malta ecosystem, but certainly when it came to transactions, monetary transactions, when it came to FDI, foreign direct investments, raising capital and moving money into a grey-listed jurisdiction was more difficult and more expensive. When it comes to the local banks, I would say there's been very little progress in being more open towards the gaming clients. So the grey listing didn't have a negative effect, and consequently has not really had a noticeable positive effect. And that's still, I think, on the open items for us as an industry. But Malta is not is not alone in that situation. We see throughout Europe that banking for the iGaming industry is becoming more difficult.
Right. Motti, what is your experience with the banking industry, not only in Malta, but abroad? Has the fact that Malta is out of the grey list had a positive effect on your relationship with banks all over the globe?
So, in the last few years, we can see an increased enforcement and some stricter guidelines coming from the banking industry. Even in Malta, before the grey listing, we saw, for example, some listed operators and listed companies that were blocked for a certain period, and with the assistance of the MGA, it was removed. But one would expect that after the de-grey listing, things will improve. However, I think that what we're experiencing is that we see that cross-border transactions with banks from other countries, first of all, made it much more expensive for the Maltese corporation, Maltese entities, and second, there are certain limitations that were put by banks outside of Malta when transacting with Maltese entities or with Maltese banks. So definitely this is something that is, I would say, in contrary to what I would have expected once Malta would be off the grey listing. And I think that the last report of the SNRA definitely will not contribute to it, with the classification of the iGaming at the highest possible rate. Yeah,
we'll come to discuss that as well. Yanica, so what do you think is the matter? Grey listing or no grey listing, we still have basically the same situation, not very positive. What do you think is the root cause of all this?
Yeah, thank you, first of all. I'm very impressed to see such a full room so early. So the truth is, I think Motti hit the nail on the head, that we were seeing this shift even before the grey listing. We're working in an industry that is subject to increased regulation and increased compliance reviews, sometimes somewhat unfairly, and we'll get into that when we discuss the SNRA. And I don't think that that's necessarily going to go away because of the grey listing. I think the grey listing is a different subject altogether, and it made things a bit worse. But the effect of what we're seeing is not necessarily grey listing, and I think we need to get used to working in this environment, unfortunately, as much as we can, and to continue to educate legislators and regulators about what we actually do and the controls we actually implement in order for them to actually come up with a classification of risk that makes sense in terms of all the controls being in place.
Right. Carl, we are obviously aware that the government and MGA in particular have done a lot of work in order to get Malta out of the grey list. Have we learned anything from this experience as a country? Has there been any silver lining? Have we come out stronger? How?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm much happier this year than last year, right?
Sure,
I
we all are.
I think that much is clear enough. But yes, we've learned, I believe we've learned that before we innovate, before we take certain steps which might increase risk, I think we've learned to make sure that the foundations are strong. And if there is a silver lining, I would say it is that now, as a jurisdiction, we are aware that across the board, the foundations are strong and that we can move ahead with that in mind. On the other hand, as my fellow panelists have said, I think for this industry in particular, while the grey listing of Malta did not help, of course, because it is the home of most operators, and the reputation of the jurisdiction is extremely important to do business with operators based here. At the same time, it is only one of a number of factors that the industry needs to cope with. And we, as the MGA and government in general, I think, have a role in that to help as well. But Yanica mentioned education. I think we've spent a lot of the grey listing period educating other countries, other foreign institutions like correspondent banks, for example, and payment processors of what Malta is, of, first of all, that the industry had nothing to do with Malta being grey listed at the time, and in general, what we were doing to get out of grey list. So we were educating about the jurisdiction. I think we need to educate more about the industry itself. Yanica mentioned controls and even the general attitude of the industry. This is not 20 years ago. The industry is more well aware of what it needs to focus on. So I think we need to educate more on that front. And at the same time, government is also helping. I mean, most of you or all of you will have seen the initiative by government to try and get a basic account for companies as an obligation to banks. We're all familiar with the Basic Payment Accounts Directive for individuals. So while that is a long and tough road, I think it's a very important initiative that government has taken to try and help with one aspect of this banking problem.
Right, good to know. Well, it seems that a lot of these issues revolve around AML regulation and toughening of AML regulation. The grey listing was initiated by Moneyval, but Malta, being a member state of European Union, also has to pay attention and take note of what the European Union itself pronounces in terms of risk, AML risk, and the industry. And as you mentioned already, just a few weeks ago, at the end of October, there was a publication of new revised version of the supranational risk assessment that was published by the European Commission, where it basically went through lots of different industries and sectors and ranked it in terms of the risk of money laundering and terrorism financing. The remote gaming industry was given the highest risk rating, 4, which is the highest. Both for money laundering risk and also for the terrorism financing. As a comparison, land-based casinos were giving rating 2, which is 2 scales lower than the remote gaming. And as far as the terrorism financing is concerned, the Commission said it is not even relevant for this industry. So Pontus, you've been in this industry longer than all of us combined together. You've
Yeah,
seen
almost.
You've seen a lot of progress and development that this industry undergone throughout the years, and all the regulation and all the mitigating measures that the companies put in place. What is your assessment? What is your view of this kind of approach that the European Commission has, slapping basically the remote gaming industry, not even the whole gaming sector, but the remote gaming industry with such a high risk score? Do you think it's reasonable?
Yeah, thank you for sending the report. It's an extensive report, and I read the part about online gaming, where, as you said, we were judged to have the highest risk level for money laundering and financing of terrorism. And to me, that's very disappointing to read that. In the report, there are several examples of how money laundering can be done in the iGaming industry, but that's not how it works in reality. We have all controls in place. Companies, at least licensed companies, are very well vetted by the regulators. I think this report is a product from somebody, it's a desktop research from somebody who doesn't know anything about online gaming, and it's a little bit sad when you look at it that it seems that our industry didn't meet these guys to communicate how we work, because if we had done that, we would never be rated at number 4 risk. We would be potentially number 2. So my learning and takeaway from this is that the industry needs to interact with the authors of such reports, because it's not helping the reputation for the industry to get that kind of report out.
Yanica, what's your view? Do you side with the Commission or rather with Pontus on this one?
With Pontus.
Thank you.
That was very clear.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's what it seems like. It's disappointing and it's confusing, and it shows that either we weren't clear with what we have in place, and we probably have a bit of blame in this, because education, I guess, goes both ways, or there really wasn't much effort being done into seeing what controls are actually in place by lots of gambling companies today. I think we work in such a highly regulated industry with so many controls. There are so many more industries that are much higher risk in reality. It is actually not possible for this industry to be that high risk, especially in light of the fact that the controls have increased and also the risk has increased. That doesn't make much sense either. Presumably, it's higher risk when there are less controls, not the other way around. Otherwise, what does that say about the controls that we are forced to put in place, right? So unfortunately, it's a very disappointing situation. But again, I guess we have to get used to trying to work in this kind of environment.
Carl, do we really need to get used to it and work in the same framework that we are pushed? I mean, because we are in the EU, and this particular report says that we are obliged, as the industry and the member states, therefore the regulators as well, to follow and take note of the report. Will you be helping regulator to do more compliance? I can't even understand what kind of more compliance there is, you know, I don't see it. But do we have to apply it? Or on the other hand, is it possible to have the national risk assessment different from the European one?
We have to consider it. It doesn't mean we have to agree with it.
Okay.
So
that's a good start.
I'm going to try and be a bit diplomatic here, right? But I don't agree with the contents of the report either. I think, and Pontus mentioned this, a number of the modalities of money laundering that I mentioned in the report just don't exist in regulated business. You find me a poker operator where I can have a room with friends and play poker online. Find me one. Because we do not license any of those at the very least. So I think for now, maybe the industry needs to get used to working within these strictures, but at the same time, not give up. I think we need to work more together, us as regulators and the industry, to educate institutions that are not specialized in gambling, like the Commission rapporteurs. But for the local NRA, we as MGA will very clearly push for a different risk rating, because the controls that are put in place, I think Yanica said it in the best way. Why are we putting controls in place if the risk is increasing anyway? The controls are in place because they are effective. Otherwise, I don't understand why we would make our operators undergo all those costs and business restrictions if we're not getting an effect out of that. And we are getting an effect. And what that means is that it needs to reflect in a lower risk than there was in the previous NRA, which was conducted and concluded before operators were subject basis.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, it's very refreshing to hear the regulator having this kind of position and using pragmatic and realistic approach and helping the industry to adapt to and use the local realities rather than one-size-fits-all approach that EU seems to propose. I would like in this context to ask the operator, how do you value this kind of attitude of the regulator? We often discuss and we often hear that the value of Malta licensing has been diminishing because the market access is shrinking. So my question to the regulators, to the operators, and I would like to start with Enrico, is there any other value apart from the value of the license itself in being here, in being in Malta?
Absolutely. Malta is way beyond just the MGA, I think, and the license. So first of all, I would start with the access to the regulator, the fact that we can have an open and a constructive dialogue with the regulator on almost any topic. The fact that Malta has reached a critical mass of talent, of skill set, of knowledge, is extremely important for the industry to be based here. The whole ecosystem that is built around gaming here, including Sigma, starting from Sigma as well, is second to none, I would say. It's not perfect. As we know, we still need more support from the banks, from the financial institutions. But yes, it's way beyond just the MGA license, the reason why the industry is based here.
Motti, what's your view on this? How does communication and relationship with the regulator here compares to multiple regulators that your multinational company has in different countries?
So, from my perspective, being in a company that has numerous licenses around the world, I think that the MGA is the one that is it's the easiest to communicate with the MGA. They are really open for discussions with the industry. And I think that they are also very, very knowledgeable when it comes to gaming. They really understand the industry and how it works. And I wish, that they will be able to educate some other regulators that trying to be harsh sometimes on the industry and getting the opposite result instead of securing the players, just pushing players to play on the black market, and this channelization is very bad for the industry. So definitely very appreciated approach by the MGA.
Pontus, if you look into the future, how do you think this approach of the regulator can develop? How can the authority help the industry more?
I think the regulator is on a good track. I think they help the companies in a good way. I think we may see some friction between some other gaming authorities and Malta as a jurisdiction, because they don't always share the same opinions on how to do things and how to regulate things. But I think that the Gaming Authority has stood up for the industry very well, and I think they just should continue.
Yanica, you propose that there is more educational activities going on with the MGA. Do you think there are certain authorities that should be first place in line for this training in Malta and as well?
I think for the time being, I think if you could have a little bit of an impact on Norway, it would be good, because they are heading in a direction for what they call the Norwegian model, which is essentially a monopoly, and it's not a modern gaming regulation. So they take a totally different route from Sweden and Denmark and Netherlands and many other countries that go for licensed systems.
So, Carl, it seems to be that you need to have an educational division in the authority from now on. But how do you think...
We do have an outreach division.
Okay, so, but how do you think the operators can better help themselves, maybe organizing themselves better, especially, when they're dealing with common challenges?
I think it's essential. So we are now, I say we because we as a regulator are mature, and I think the industry has matured. We are no longer the industry and regulator we were a decade or 2 decades ago, right? And I think with the challenges that are being faced, a lot of them are common. Naturally, operators will have different priorities, just like we will have different opinions to some of our counterparts. But on common challenges, it's essential that the industry cooperates more, and I think even we and the industry need to cooperate more on matters such as education. I say that because I'll take the SNRA as an example. We sent, because I checked when I saw the finalized report, I said, we must have sent feedback at a point. It was a year or so ago, but we did send very voluminous feedback on the controls within the industry, on the controls that the MGA has over and above that, on the impossibility of certain things transpiring within the industry, even for reasons unrelated to AML-CFT, even purely for counter-fraud, for the operators to protect themselves commercially. But it wasn't taken into account. Now I understand we are one of 27 member states, so that is one voice. But I think if our voice and the industry's voice were to be joined, we would have more of an impact.
Right. There is one last point that I would like to discuss with this panel, and this relates to innovation. Innovation is crucial, important tool to survive in this fast-moving industry, let alone to thrive. Just about a week ago or so, the MGA issued a consultation for a revised policy for the use of crypto assets and blockchain. The current regime under the sandbox, in my personal view, has not been super successful. And I think one of the factors contributing to this is that there was a very low limit on the monthly acceptance allowed, maximum monthly acceptance allowed by crypto from the players. And the first thing I checked when I received this draft, I searched for the limit, and there wasn't any. So I said, okay, it's a good sign already. But if you look at the industry, Pontus, do you think it's the right time for the authority, for Malta, to actually push for or consider introduction of crypto acceptance at a larger scale? Is it the right time? Is it necessary for the industry now?
Yeah, I think you should look into that, and I think even though the crypto world has experienced some headwind in the recent times, I think it's something which is coming and it's going to be bigger in this industry, so for sure you have to start working to accommodate that also for Maltese licensed companies.
Card, can you give us 1 minute rundown on what's there, what's proposed?
1 minute is hard, but the limit is in there, right? Some of the restrictions are still there. Essentially what we did is, you said it wasn't successful. I understand, but for us, we measured the success of the sandbox in terms of the outcomes that we got from it. And we learned which of the restrictions that were there had an impact. We conducted familiarization visits on all the licenses that were within the sandbox. And we used that to understand what worked, what didn't work. And that is reflected in the consultation on the new policy. So for example, from what we saw, there was no need to have that limit because the limit was imposed based on a risk that was perceived, but then didn't transpire to be a real one. You know, it's one of my pet phrases, perceived risk versus real risk. And from that perspective, it was successful for us because we learned, and now we have, I mentioned the foundations, right, as the silver lining after being de-gray listed. We know that as a country, not just as MGA, we have the right foundations to innovate, and we have the right process. We check, we learn, and we innovate.
Enrico, from the risk perspective, again, I'm going back to SNRA. Remote gambling, very high. Crypto assets, very high risk. So it's like very high to the power of 2. How are we going to manage this at jurisdictions? Should we engage in some reputational management activities? What would that be?
Yes, yes, for sure. It's like the highest possible, the most explosive combination when it comes to risk management. And I really think that in Malta, where Malta has always taken the lead in Europe when it comes to cryptocurrencies and blockchain in general, I think in Malta we will be able to find that right way of explaining the risk, because it's always about managing the risk. And it's been mentioned several times, the education. I think certainly all of us as industry representatives need to continue to educate all these counterparts, all these stakeholders, in order for them to understand our business and be able to manage that risk.
Right. Well, we're running out of time. To conclude, I think despite the challenges, Malta retains its preeminent position as a gaming hub. And I think a very interesting point that came up from this conversation is that the regulator and the industry, the operators, should work together. They need to work together to keep this up and to keep us in the right place. On this note, I close the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.